Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 20. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. I saw in the news that Red Hat's contributing a comprehensive container tools collection to the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. What are the thoughts?
I think before we dig into this, we should probably talk a little bit more about the CNCF. They're an open source advocate group that is a part of the Linux Foundation, but they're more focused on advancing technologies for companies leveraging public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. They also host a bunch of critical projects, such as Kubernetes. So this announcement could be amazing news, or it could be terrible news, in that Red Hat might be trying to donate this back to the community so they become like community-led projects like Kubernetes, or it could be Red Hat is dumping responsibility for these projects on to the CNCF and isn't going to continue to invest in these tools. I guess I'd be curious to know what people's thoughts are on that.
I'm staying optimistic. I'm actually really impressed by Red Hat and donating this, because it's not just like one thing they donated. They donated basically their whole open source alternative to Docker tech stack. They donated Builda, which is used to actually build images. And then they did ComposeFS, which is a new file system that's going to allow kind of like overlay file systems on top of whatever you have. And that'll play in really nicely with the next thing they donated, which is bootc, or bootable containers. We'll get into that one in a second, because I'm really excited about that. They donated Podman and Podman Desktop, which are open source alternatives to Docker. And then they donated Scopio, which is used to look at and analyze containers. So it's a significant contribution, as well as I don't feel like they dumped it on us as much as they gave it to us. Because I know bootc was looking to be worked on by a lot of people, and that it has other dependencies like ComposeFS. And now that these are all out in the public for all of us to contribute, people can start really moving forward with that. And the person who's behind bootc, he's a Red Hat engineer called Colin Walters, I believe. And he got even more excited when we donated this, and he's still active and still trying to push it forward, but he can't do it by himself. And now he doesn't have to.
I think this is really great to provide a really legitimized set of alternatives to Docker and that ecosystem. We've had various companies give this a go in the past. We've had AWS with Finch and various others. But I think this really legitimizes Podman as an alternative to that. It's part of the CNCF, as is Kubernetes and everything else. So my hope is that those integrations get much deeper and that these actually become first-party citizens rather than sort of the red-headed stepchild of some of these solutions like we see at the moment.
Can someone make me smart on Podman? I've used it a few times. I've got a basic understanding of the differences, but where does it really stand out between, Podman and Docker in terms of the comparative offerings?
Rootless containers was the big deal for me. Is why I moved to it for all my home lab stuff, but I'm sure there's probably more awesome functionality I'm not aware of.
You can do rootless containers in Docker though, right?
Yes, but the power of defaults, because Podman does it by default.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's also not a daemon and things running for Podman, which makes it a bit more lightweight than Docker might otherwise be. It is also OCI compliant, so a lot of stuff you build in Docker will just translate over to Podman. And it's open source first, whereas Docker has got that corporate entity behind it. Podman is now part of the CNCF, so doesn't quite have that level of corporate sponsorship. So if you're worried about that stuff, maybe a CNCF-sponsored project is the way to go.
Are there things to watch out for if you're using Podman, though, things that are known not to work very well?
Yeah, I've had to do it myself, where I've tried using Podman as a drop-in replacement and then just didn't work correctly. My particular use case was around GPU allotment that I was trying to share within multiple containers. But maybe it's gotten better.
So you were going to tell us about bootc.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for bootc. So bootc is, again, bootable containers. And I've been working with the Universal Blue team on trying to scope out what this would look like, add some tooling around it, and make it really easy for anybody to just have their own customized operating system with the packages they want all up to date, but in tools that I know how to use, which is Docker files or container files and, my CI/CD systems. And so the idea here is that you can just treat your OS as you do a Docker container. and you can have it run once a week, where it goes and fetches the latest packages, builds a container image of that, and then your computer will automatically pull down that image whenever it's ready. And then on your next reboot, it will apply that new change set as an atomic image. So it's like A/B partitioning. So that way you always have something you can roll back to if you need to. And bootc also is the tools to make that really easy, where I can just, switch container images, or I can roll back, or other stuff like that.
And what are you using this for? This isn't presumably for your normal server stuff. This is for different workloads.
This is actually for everything. I'm actually using this on my laptop, my mainly daily driver, through the Universal Blue project, which it's in a weird state because it's half based on RPM OSTree, but it's also half based on bootc. It's because bootc is inherently dependent on RPM OSTree currently, and they're working really hard to get rid of that because they want that to be used by everybody. Canonical, SUSE, Mac OS for all we care. But that's the big point of contention, and we're close, but we're not there yet. And so that's my desktop, but my servers are actually using 100% bootc, and those are running some basic workloads like Nginx and Pi-hole and whatnot. And that is because in Linux, using systemd, you can basically specify a container as a service, like a normal systemd unit file. And so that's what I do. I basically just say, hey, systemd, when you start up, you're going to have this systemd file, and I put that in the container file, and I tell it, put on this image and mount it here and go. And then when it boots up, systemd takes that, pulls down the image, starts it up. Hopefully I've mounted my data correctly, and it just picks right up back where I left off. And then this updates nightly for me, so I always have the latest stuff.
Not sure I'm getting it. What's the advantage of doing that over just using a container?
So this is not a container, this is a VM. And if I didn't have my Kubernetes cluster, then how am I going to get this to run? I want it to run as a container, but I need something to run it on. And now I can treat my VM the same way I treat my container.
So rather than doing something like baking an AMI, you would just have a base set of things to bootstrap, start up a basic kernel, systemd would then pull a container image that you were using your CI to regularly bake. So maybe you'd build an Ubuntu container with Nginx installed, and that's really lightweight. It's like a 4-line Docker file to build that. You have that running in your CI regularly, and then every time you reboot your VM, it pulls that latest container image, gets the latest Ubuntu, already patched, latest Nginx from the archive, and you're off to the races. All you're doing is mounting the data directory.
Pretty much.
So to summarize, it's in-place updates to the base operating system, and you're configuring that as like a nightly job to like pull those updates in, and you're relying on bootc kind of doing the heavy lifting of like making sure everything's okay. Like you said, that A/B partition thing, is that like a
Yep.
blue-green deployment type thing of, okay, once it's successful, I'll swap to the new one, or else I roll back?
That's exactly right.
Cool.
On all of the things above, Gary hit a bunch of the good points. Shin, you hit a good point about the rollbacks and how easy that is. And I think the biggest, strongest selling point of this is that I treat my VM the same way I treat my container. I can build it with 4 lines of container files, just add this one package that I want that doesn't come with Ubuntu by default, and I get it.
It's basically using all of the modern cloud tooling that we're all used to for building our containers to run in Kubernetes or Swarm or whatever else to build an entire VM.
That's right. So I get to treat my whole stack, except for my hypervisor, from top to the bottom using the same tools. And it's been really powerful for me.
Although I guess in theory you could treat your hypervisor in that way if you wanted to as well. You just bake your hypervisor image, and every time you reboot the box, it gets the fresh updates.
One day. Today's not that day. But yes, I really like that idea. Proxmox, if you're listening, please do that.
Okay, so you said that it fits in with your normal tools. Can you just run me through that stack? How are you putting it together?
GitLab CI and a container file. And that's really it. The container file is just a normal container file, except that the base image is a special bootc one that comes with the kernel and like network manager and stuff installed as a base. I have a Fedora, and there's a CentOS image out there already. And from there, I do my layering, what I want to add to that base image. So in my case, I'm adding some systemd unit files. I just copy paste those in, and then the GitLab CI builds it every night.
But the difference between using this and something like a LXC machine container is that you treat those container images as immutable rather than being ones that you go in and treat like pets.
Correct. When I'm saying container, I'm thinking like application container, like everyone's familiar with Podman. It's an atomic image that runs exactly the same no matter where you run it. The trick was, how do I get these VMs configured correctly once I've booted up my container, right? How do I differentiate them? And I actually came up with a way where I just installed Cloud Init in the base image during my CI pipeline. And then when the VM comes up, it just uses Anaconda and Cloud Init to just bootstrap the container the first time. And then after that, it retains all the data, and then it switches to the new builds that it comes from my registry overnight, picks it right where it left off.
I remember hearing about various different technologies to put containers in VMs. I think those were primarily driven by some of the technologies like confidential computing, where having it as a VM then meant you could use things like the confidential VM technology to then encrypt that. I remember there was Kata containers, and there were, I think there's something like Coco, the confidential containers stuff. I wonder if this has any crossover with that, or if it's quite separate.
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't see why not. As long as, the underlying host hardware is confidential compute compliant, that could be a pretty easy way to use standard tools to do that.
So we recently had KubeCon and Cloud Native Con. There were a whole bunch of announcements, and we can't cover them all. If you want to run down, then we can throw some links in. But were there any things there that caught your eye in particular that you think are worth talking about?
So major props to a coworker of mine who did a lovely summary as he attended KubeCon and watching things remotely. I think two things came up that I thought were of note. The first one was, and I watched like a 1-minute highlight reel, and it also talked a lot about this. It was the first thing raised in the keynote was around patent trolls. And I know patent trolls are kind of an annoying thing that lots of the industry has to deal with. It just seemed like a very strange choice for like drumming up energy and getting everyone excited with like, let's rant about how terrible patent trolls are. So that's the first thing I thought was a bit odd. And the other thing, I think on the ground that I saw some people I was following on Blue Sky were talking about was there was a lot of talk of AI in the events, which is kind of to be expected. But when people were walking around in the booths, not much was happening around AI, which maybe won't surprise anyone, but it felt like the marketing push is still there, but people getting on the ground utility from AI and trying to sell it directly to people isn't really connecting. So those are two things I thought were interesting.
I'm not sure that patent trolls and the decline of AI were in most people's summary of KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, but I'm going to take it.
I think the patent troll stuff is, I don't want to say self-serving, but I think that comes from their part of the Linux Foundation, and that's kind of a responsibility to protect from patent trolls all these cloud native technologies that are underneath their umbrella. Maybe they're just trying to establish like, hey, we're still needed.
It's like if I'd had a bad day at the office and I wanted to rant about something specific, but I'm not going to do it at the opening keynote for like the biggest cloud native event of the year. It just seemed odd.
Something big must have happened. I wonder what.
Yeah, I feel like I've missed an internal memo somewhere. It's going on.
Something that I really found that I was curious about your guys' take on was that KubeVirt 1.4 was announced. KubeVirt, for those who don't know, is a way to run a VM in a container, kind of the opposite of what most people do. And it powers some tools like OpenShift and Harvester to kind of allow you to do Kubernetes first compute, but also use the same tools and patterns that you would use for a VM. And 1.4 announced GPU support, so you can now run your AI workloads in Kubernetes using KubeVirt if that's what you want to do. Have you guys used KubeVirt at all, or have any opinions on kind of the inversion of running a VM inside a container?
I've always thought it was a cool idea when I've seen it demoed at FOSDEM and things like that. But I've never really got the utility of it because I'm probably using some kind of virtualization to run the Kubernetes cluster in the first place. So therefore, my view is that I would just use that same virtualization to run the VM. Now, I know there's a bunch of caveats around that, like if you're a platform engineering team or you want to give your developers a quick way to spin up development VMs and things, maybe it's good for that. But I just think I'd rather vend them a VM on top of VMware or Proxmox or AWS or whatever it is. it just seems like added complexity to me.
Yeah, my gut feel has always been that they're different things, and it kind of makes sense to have a different control plane for them. Wasn't it all part of the broader story of Red Hat moving away from OpenStack and really doubling down on OpenShift and saying you can do everything through OpenShift and therefore run your virtual machines through this container type runtime? And haven't they since then effectively gone back on that and got back into the OpenStack market?
Yes and no. From what I can tell, they definitely shifted that way because they had put a lot of money right into OpenShift and a lot of development time. And this was kind of the one platform fits all kind of feel that these kind of companies that try to sell you the full stack really like, especially Red Hat, right? They love selling you that full stack. But you're absolutely right. With the changes to the VMware licensing, the virtualization hypervisor market just totally got upended. And so a lot of people are now running back to try to fill that gap. And OpenStack has made what I have not expected. It has made a resurgence way above what I expected. So kudos to OpenStack.
I think one other thing I saw that looked quite interesting was Crow, KRO, which is the Kube Resource Orchestrator. I think AWS are building this project, and it looks like it's an abstraction layer on top of Kubernetes for managing like custom resources. It's an interesting looking project in that it might disrupt the market a little bit, in that there's potentially companies out there doing things very similar. So if AWS decide to invest heavily in this project and in this area, it could eat some of the established companies' lunch. So essentially what Crow is doing is providing like a nice abstraction layer around custom resource groups. So if you don't want to deal with the complexity of custom resources in Kubernetes, Crow will let you simplify that. So it gives you a nicer layer on top of it. I think it's got some integrations with AWS as well to make like deploying these things into AWS easier.
I can see that being useful. There's not really anything out there that kind of manages the life cycle of custom resources right now. I know that OpenShift does have something for that. What is it called? The Operator Lifecycle Manager, I believe?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about Crow is that it lets you define, or engineers define like a resource group. And so you'll deploy that resource group into Kubernetes, and it'll automatically provide an API. And so people can request instances of that resource group quite easily. So for example, I can create a Crow resource group for like an Nginx container, specify a couple of arguments, and then I'll say, okay, this is a part of our platform. Engineers can then request instances from that using Kubernetes. So it's extending Kubernetes API functionality more easily. So it's kind of AWS treading into the platform engineering space.
That is interesting. I wonder if there's any examples you can go play with, like spin up on EKS or something.
Yeah, they've got some example documentation. Again, it's early days in the project. I think it was announced at KubeCon, so that's why I'm talking about it now. But it's very experimental, very early days, but looks quite interesting.
And they do make sure to say in the first sentence of their release notes that it is an experimental open source project and that they're just releasing it to the public so people can play with it and that you probably shouldn't use it in production yet.
I like it. I'm looking at the docs. I think this has potential.
All right, well, it's probably time to wrap this all up. But before we do, just a quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support, where for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. And sometimes you receive episodes early. If you'd like to send us any questions or feedback, please do to show@hybridcloudshow.com. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.